What's up, everybody? It is 4 o'clock, day 2, 10.5 Brisket Commandments. Before we dive into the wrap stage, I'm just going to recap some of yesterday's topics. I'm going to give it a couple minutes just for people to log on. Hopefully we get some viewers. Thanks for tuning in on day 2. Thanks for tuning in yesterday. Thanks for tuning in today. Just a heads up, I've also changed some stuff in my setup, trying to keep the focus on the content in front of me. So if there's any issues with the quality or anything, just put a comment in and we'll try to adjust for next time. Jay Crawford, yes, this is episode 2. Yesterday we did a live at 4 o'clock going over the 10 Commandments of the Brisket. I'm going to do a quick recap on yesterday's stuff today, and then we're gonna proceed. I think we finished at number 6, basically seasoning your brisket. So we're gonna recap. So yesterday we talked about the first 5 or 6 commandments. The first commandment being make a plan and stick to your plan. And I kind of made a rough draft of a plan that I stenciled out for you guys. Ideally, the serving time, if you're picking a serving time of 5 o'clock, you allow for a 3-hour rest, which means you want to be ready around 2 p.m. If your dinner time is 5 p.m. and a 12-hour cook brings you to 2 a.m. and so on. And I did a little bit of a diagram. Yesterday I showed it and it was backwards. Here's the diagram today. Hopefully my penmanship is legible. I will also take a photo of this, screenshot it, and put it in the comments for you guys. I just want to kind of recap a couple of quick things about this yesterday. So in this plan, in this strategy, the goal is to have a 12-hour cook. In having a 12-hour cook, you have 2 portions of the cook and a rest. So you're going to have a low and slow period where the brisket is unwrapped, which is what we've just done. Then you're going to have a low and slow period that's wrapped. And then once the brisket gets to an established temperature and texture that you're happy with, then you can pull it off and let it rest. So there are a few advantages and disadvantages to cooking the brisket specific ways. I just want to briefly touch on the most important low and slow portion, in my opinion, is at the front end where you're getting a lot of smoke. And the reason is because the brisket meat will take on more smoke at first, and toward the end of the cook, not as much smoke. And therefore, the concept of smoking is basically a wood fire at a lower temperature will provide more smoke, and a wood fire with higher temperatures is going to provide less smoke. Obviously, we want a clean burning fire to provide clean smoke so that we're not getting kind of a bitter, funky taste to the brisket. That being said, so I govern with a 12-hour cook. My temp target is around 225 degrees. And, I've done briskets at 275 degrees. I've done them at 300 degrees. And I've tried the hot and fast stuff as well. I believe that it yields the best results if you're rocking a brisket at 225 degrees for the first portion. When we get to the wrap portion, which is where we're at now, then we can kind of mess with the temps a little bit because it's more protected with the foil or the aluminum foil or the butcher paper. And then we're going to get it to that last lap. The final lap is what we talked about yesterday. In the plan, my final lap target is 195 degrees. And at that point, I'm starting to measure texture with a probe, with a meat probe, the ThermoPen, the ThermoMax, or a toothpick. And I'm trying to get a texture idea of where I want it to be. The more tender, obviously, the easier the probe will go in and out of the brisket. And lastly, the rest part, I didn't elaborate yesterday on why the rest portion is important, and the reason the rest portion is important is because, just like we talked about when it gets to the sweating period, which is where the brisket is at right now, the muscle as it cooks tenses up and it gets tough and it gets tight, and this is the same with any meat across the board. When you rest it, especially such a big piece of meat like this, in the resting period, you're allowing the muscles to relax. You're allowing them to just come back to the state that they were pre-cook, like we talked about yesterday, pliable, having some give, having some texture. That's where we really, really want to be. Just a heads up, I can't see any comments, so if you guys are commenting, I apologize. I can't see it. I'll try my best to get to them as well as I can. What's up, guys? Thanks for the feedback. I appreciate it. All right, so yesterday, make a plan, stick to the plan. Rule number 2, or commandment number 2, was be prepared and have the right tools. We went over the tools necessary and have them ready so you're not running at 7 in the morning to get tin foil to wrap your brisket. Then we talked about selecting a good brisket. We talked about marbling in the flat, not as important in the point portion, because the point portion is more marbled and is more forgiving. So if you're finding a marbled striations of fat through the flat portion of the brisket, you're onto the right. You're on track for a better brisket. A thick flat is also key. The thinner the flat, you can find it, learn on the page. It's from yesterday. If you're going to if you're looking for a thicker flat, basically you're eliminating ends that aren't going to be cooked as evenly. And as you noticed yesterday in my aggressive trim style, I kind of part ways with most of that anyway. But I do try to start off with as thick as flat as possible. And then we talked about that we trim the brisket. I showed you kind of what I do. I made the brisket look like a race car. You guys agreed. I actually posted a picture earlier today and people were commenting on the race car concept. The goal there is aerodynamic. The goal is to keep the brisket flowing so that the temperature is accessing all parts of the brisket evenly. The smoke is contacting all parts of the brisket evenly, and you're avoiding any valleys or any parts where liquid can pool up and create, affect the bark and all that stuff. Taylor, thank you. I love the aggressive trim. So the commandment, though, isn't necessarily to trim aggressively. The commandment is to use your trimmings wisely. So I mentioned yesterday that I keep the trimmings. This is what the final product of the brisket I took out. There's probably about 4 to 5 pounds of good quality meat here. And what I try to do, rule of thumb for like a medium style ground beef, is to go an 80-20 ratio. 80 being lean, 20% being fat. So what I try to do is fill a table pan in this regard. I don't know if you guys can see that well from back there. But basically, I've got this portion here is more lean, and then I take 20% of my pan and I fill it up with some fatty stuff. So this here is going to be ground up, and it's going to become burgers and ground beef for chili and for spaghetti sauce, nachos, tacos, you name it. Incredible quality meat that is far better than the ground beef you're going to get at the supermarket. You know what's going in it. Let's not let our imagination go wild the other way. Use your trimmings wisely. You're paying good buck for this beef. I'll even say to the point, which is actually one of the commandments, is buy your brisket on sale. It's one thing we touched on yesterday. It's the next commandment. Brisket on sale is number 7. If you can get beef at $2.99 a pound brisket, right? And we're talking, I don't want to spend on high-end brisket. At $2.99, even if you're grinding up the entire brisket and using it for ground beef, that's cheaper than you can find ground beef most of the time. And now you know what ingredient is happening, what ingredients are going into your beef. So I 100% recommend getting yourself a meat grinder, using your trimmings wisely, creating your own ground beef, and you guys will be amazed at the flavor that the brisket, the flavor of the beef is unbelievable. It's next level. It's mind-boggling. Make yourself a simple burger patty, no seasoning, no nothing. Sear it on a cast iron pan or in your barbecue, and it's next level. You're gonna really love it. All right, commandment number 8. Using optional techniques like water pans, the Texas crutch, drippings, and au jus. Au jus for Chef Luke from the Finch Market. Au jus. How do you guys say it? Is it with an O? Is it with an A? I don't know. So, using a water pan is optional. It's not necessary. If you're going to use a water pan, I love just the bread pan style that you get at the dollar store. Probably 3 for $1.25, and fill it with cold water is key. And you want to keep it as close to your heat source as possible. What happens there is if it's close to your fire, it's going to boil and steam, creating humidity and moisture in the environment. Having moisture and humidity in the environment helps keeps a moist and humid product with the brisket, and it also, I love the half a cow. That's a great idea. The humidity is going to create a moist product inside, and actually, if we get into the smoke science a bit for just a second, the humidity in the environment is actually what's going to get your smoke ring. Even though we call it a smoke ring, you can achieve a smoke ring without smoke. The goal is to create a humid environment. So the more humid the environment, the more color you're going to get in that smoke ring, and the more flavor you're going to get. And one last thing, in terms of temperature, I'm going to rewind just a bit, things that I forgot to mention yesterday. I put my brisket in cold. I do not bring it to room temperature. And the reason I put it in cold is I believe that it absorbs more smoke. From the books I've read and from the research I've done, I believe that it brings in more smoke flavor when you put it in cold. And the second tip that I forgot to mention yesterday, and this one's huge, and it's surrounding the trimming concept, I also throw my brisket in the freezer for about an hour before I trim. And that just helps get the surroundings and the outer edges of the brisket, they firm up just a tad. And when they firm up just a tad and you have a sharp knife, the trimming process goes much, much easier. And you guys probably saw yesterday while I was trimming, it's very seamless. Not a lot to it with a sharp knife. Having that hour in the freezer, it doesn't have to be an hour. As long as you're able to firm it up without it freezing, basically is the goal. So don't be afraid to throw it in the fridge or the freezer for a good hour before you start the trim. Optional techniques. Let's get back on track. Optional techniques. We talked about the water pan. So the Texas crutch is where we're at right now. Are we going to wrap the brisket? I believe that I yield the best product, the best end result when I wrap the brisket. So what's happening is during the cooking process, if we go back to our plan of 12 hours, we got a 12-hour plan, and once we get to a temperature of about 155, 160 degrees, maybe even as high as 170 degrees, it starts to sweat. And when it starts to sweat, it really binds the rub to the brisket. So I'm going to pull this off and give you guys an idea of what this is looking like. So I hope you guys can see the glistening happening. But this is a brisket that's been on. My game plan was to have this at wrap temp for around 4 o'clock today to show you guys what it looks like. But you can really see the brisket taking on a shine and a glisten. And then obviously I'm coming out and I'm spritzing this stuff with a liquid. I choose apple cider vinegar, but whatever you're choosing, you want to make sure that glisten is happening before. And that's really going to help bind that rub to the brisket and create that bark. And I mentioned yesterday, if I can massage the exterior of the brisket just like that, I'm pressing hard on there and the bark is not smearing off, then I know I'm where I need to be with the bark, and the bark is set, and if I wrap, it's not going to hinder anything. Another quick tip, once the brisket is ready to go, I typically double up my pans in order to help just the flimsiness of it when I'm carrying it in and out. Nobody wants a brisket on the ground. So I'm not going to double it up because I'm going to move this out of the way, but this is the concept. Here we go. So the wrapping process is real simple. Let me get this out of the way. Thanks again for tuning in. I don't know if we're giving something away today. I'm waiting for a text. We might be giving something away. We could be. Could happen. Actually, we might save it for tomorrow. I got a secret ingredient that I finish up the brisket with, and maybe we'll give one of those away tomorrow. If you guys have any questions, please like and share. Comment in the bottom if you have any questions. Big believer in these barbecue tools. Simple dollar store gloves and some nitrile gloves on top. Food safe, powder free. So we take the brisket out of the pan, and she goes right there in the middle. And we can use this little bit of jus that's come out of the brisket since and add some flavor back into the brisket. Now, understand that during the front end of the cook, this hasn't sweat a lot. So a lot of the fat that becomes liquid and liquefies has not rendered. It has not become juice. The juice that we've injected in hasn't been forced up because the muscle hasn't really tensed up and tightened up yet. As the muscle tightens up and tenses up, what's happening is the fats and the juices kind of render out, which makes room for this thing to pull together and tighten up. And you'll notice the brisket actually gets noticeably smaller. And then at the end of the cook, all of the juice, all that juice, that au jus as we call it, is available to use in the cook. So I'm going to try my best to form around the race car, and I don't want this thing to steam. And what's happening here is when that muscle gets to the sweating point, it's cooling itself off, and having this foil is going to help keep the moisture in the brisket, and it's going to help kind of speed it through that stall just a little bit. So I want to be as tight as possible, and I want to have some access. So on this side, I'm going to give 2 folds. And you know, everybody has different ways to fold and wrap their brisket. You can use butcher paper like we talked about. I find to get a better result with foil. And basically, the difference between foil and butcher paper is with butcher paper, people are noticing that they get a better bark. While I don't disagree that you're going to get a great bark, I prefer to lean toward guaranteed tenderness, and I find I yield that the tenderness and the full rendering of the fats inside the brisket when I wrap with foil. So yes, as tight as possible. Rick commented, nice and tight. And I'm leaving the backside open here a little bit. I had a little bit of the injection left over from yesterday, so I left the backside open here a little bit. So I basically have created an envelope where the juice can't escape, and I'm going to add the rest of this au jus. And I'm going to fold it in and then tighten it up. For this au jus, so again, just a reminder, yesterday we used Butcher Barbecue original brisket recipe, and we used the Cosmos Q brisket injection. We used basically used a half portion of each, and put them in the cold water, 2 cups of cold water. At this point, if you didn't have any left, you could use beef broth, beef consommé. You can use kind of the Bovril stuff or the no-name concentrated beef broth and add some. Or you can trust that the injection you've already put in is going to yield enough liquid that it's going to stay moist inside. And I'm a big believer of the double wrap, even though this is nice and tight. Now I'm going to wrap it against the seam so that I'm not losing any liquid. And that's her. So, super basic tip that I love about this. At this point, as long as you're using a convection style cooker, so be it a drum, be it a pellet grill, be it an offset or a reverse flow, or even your oven, if you're using an oven, you would use a convection style mode, because this isn't taking in any more smoke. Now we're just trying to heat this thing up. At this point in the cook, the brisket is protected. The color is going to stay roughly the same. I'm going to recommend that this is the point where you can mess with your timeline. So if your guests call and say, "Oh my God, we're running early," or something happens to your agenda and you need to serve early, at this point we can start to rush the cook. And this is where it's very important to monitor the internal temp of the brisket, aiming for that final lap of 195 degrees. 195 degrees is not the finishing temp, it's the final lap temp, where at 195 we start to probe this thing for tenderness. Depending on the muscle buildup, how the fats have rendered, if they're rendered, how well they're rendered, it could be tough and still need to go for another 10, 15 degrees. It may be ready at 198 degrees. So once you get, set an alarm with an internal probe And once you get to 195 degrees, I'm checking this thing every 10 minutes if possible. So that's the gist of it when it comes to wrapping the brisket, the concept of wrapping the brisket. If you need to rush this thing, if you're at competition, for example, and you need to rush your brisket cook, if it's wrapped, it's far more forgiving to rush it once it's wrapped. Don't rush the cook before it's wrapped, unless you're doing a hot and fast concept, which is not something we're talking about today, but maybe we'll do some lives on a hot and fast brisket eventually. All right, that was commandment number 8. So, the forever-ending question, fat side up versus fat side down. I don't have the answer for you. I'm not going to tell you that fat side up is correct, and I'm not going to tell you that fat side down is correct. What I'm going to tell you is one science factor, and the other is the commandment, and the commandment is use your fat to protect your flat. So, that being said, if your heat source is coming from underneath the brisket, the flat is the most vulnerable part of the brisket, and it needs to be protected. I'm going to put the fat between my heat source and the flat. If my heat is coming from the top, if I'm using a non-convection cooker or an offset burner where the heat source is coming up and over based on the airflow of that cooker because it's being pulled out from the vents on the side, then I want the fat to be on top of the brisket. Same concept to protect the flat. The flat is the vulnerable part. It's the part that's the toughest to get bang on consistency. Use the fat to protect the flat. Just a little bit of science as to why I also like fat side down is, and we talked about this the other day when I did a live about steak and rubbing with oil, but basically oil and water do not mix. So there's a concept that if we cook with the fat on top, as it renders, it's going to distribute through the meat. The reality is the meat is 95% water, and as that fat is distributing and rendering out, it's not going to penetrate through the water in the meat. It will distribute up and help the bark set. It will, there's lots of benefits to it, but the reality is it's not going to come through the meat because the oil from the fat is going to prevent it from combining with the water. Vice versa, if the fat is on the bottom, as the fat's rendered down because of gravity, the fat portion on the bottom can act like a bowl and will hold the fats in. Lastly, just quickly on the wrapping concept, I'm going to layer this up one more time, if I so choose, with another layer of foil on top. And this is not a necessity. Some people are going to throw this on the grill without a pan. At this point, because it's evenly cooked, at this point, because it's protected, I'm okay to keep it in the pan. The only thing is I still wanted to cook evenly in convection, so by adding this layer, and this is, I don't always do this, the concept of this grill is cleanliness. It's to keep my grill as clean as possible. So I'm just going to add this on top. So we already know my brisket is double wrapped, it's protected, and all I'm doing is basically adding a layer to the top because there's a layer on the bottom and I want it to be consistent on both sides. So Rick says, bark will not build on the fat side down for me. Hey, like I said, it's everybody has their differences. You can rock it either way. I just explained to you the science, and that's based on some research I've done. Wicked website you guys can check out, AmazingRibs.com. Phenomenal advice on there. He's a scientist and myth bust, and he talks about smoke ring, and he talks about whether or not to wrap and fat side up and fat side down. Excellent resource. So based on the research I've done, protect your flat with your fat. What else we got? 2 commandments left. Texture trumps temperature. So while I preach to use the guideline and have that internal probe, if I were to tell you that every brisket is done at 203 degrees, I'm doing you a disservice. If I tell you they're all going to be ready at 210 degrees, same thing. So, which is why I'm back to that 195 degrees as the final lap. If we get to the final lap of the brisket at 195 degrees and we start probing for tenderness, for texture, that's where we're going to get a win every time. If I take this thing off and put it in and let it rest for 3 hours at a temperature, Sure, it's a good guideline, and we're going to yield consistent results. But if you take some time and understand the texture and the feel, and like I mentioned yesterday, learning to feel it just like peanut butter or butter, whatever texture you're aiming for, that's the end game. That's the goal. Get the probe out, get a toothpick out, and learn that texture. Once you get the perfect texture, that peanut butter texture, the butter texture, throw this thing on to rest. Let the muscles relax. Let the moisture redistribute throughout the brisket, and we're off to the races. So today's much shorter than yesterday. I appreciate you tuning in. One quick thing, tomorrow, final episode at 4 o'clock. We're going to slice through this thing, and I'm going to sample it, and hopefully it's good. And we're going to talk about the final commandment, which has to do with slicing and how we slice and how we portion the brisket and the different areas and how to work with the fat that's available. So often I see some people just slice right down the middle and they squeeze the juices out of it. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the 10.5. I always like to add a little value. 10.5 commandment. I don't even know how you say that. Tomorrow, 10.5 commandments. The final commandment, slice against the grain. And we're going to show you how we do that tomorrow. We're also going to give away a booster rub tomorrow. So House of Barbecue Experts has an incredible finishing dust, a finishing rub called Booster. It's an all-natural, basically formulated from dehydrated vegetables. And it's an incredible, it's like an MSG without MSG. It's pretty neat. So tomorrow we're going to finish our brisket off with the Booster rub, and we're going to give one away. So please like, share, comment. I hope to see you guys back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bon barbecue, as the boys say. JP and Max, peace out.